Welcome. Yesterday, we started to look at a very important lesson. And in particular, we started to look at the importance of banks within Canada today. We talked a little bit about why Canada qualifies as what we call a branch banking system. And we also, in the second half of the lesson, started to look a little bit at how banks in Canada and in other countries are actually able, by loaning out money that they may not necessarily have a perfect claim to, create new sources of money and actually act as a money multiplier within the economic system. During our lesson, we ended off by doing some accounting ledgers where we looked at the creation of money in a monopoly bank. And we said that in those situations where you have one bank that controls all private banking for a country, things are actually pretty simple in terms of money creation. The bank knows that all money will inevitably come back to it, and it can take quite a lot of risk in terms of its initial loan, so that in creating money, it can actually create quite a lot all at once, uh, just based on its security. Things are usually not quite so simple in most countries, though, including Canada. And the reason why is that while banks still have the ability to take chances with the deposits that they have in terms of other people's money, they don't always have the security or the knowledge that the money will come back to them in the end. And that means that because banking may actually be done at multiple institutions, the creation of money will still occur, but it often occurs in more stages and it often occurs with a little of a degree of more conservatism at play. In a multi-banking world, we're now going to assume that you can bank at any particular institution. We're also going to develop a model where we're going to assume that banks are going to give out as much as they can. So they are going to still do what they can, in theory, feel secure doing, and that everybody who takes money out of the bank in terms of new loans will ultimately use that money and all of the money will come back into the banking system. You should understand that in real life, some money that goes out in loans may actually kind of become a drainage. It may partially be used towards savings and not make its way entirely back into the bank. We can't really accommodate for those particular potentialities in our model. And so, to simplify things, we are going to assume that if money goes out, while it will trade hands, at some point in time, the money that goes out as a loan will come back into the banking system. We just don't know which particular bank it will go to. To show how money is created in this particular model, we're going to go through a similar process to what we saw yesterday. And in particular, we're going to start with a simple deposit of money that goes into a bank. We're going to assume it's the same numbers, that $10,000 is going to be put into Bank A. The customer who puts that money in is going to have security in the sense that they'll have a deposit that's given to them, and the bank will have knowledge that while they owe that deposit, they now have $10,000 they can play around with. Assuming a 10% reserve ratio, I should have put that on the screen, but it's assumed. The bank is going to, just like before, hold the $1,000 as a guaranteed security for the $10,000 deposit. That is, however, once you get past that initial required cash reserve, going to free up $9,000 left over in excess reserves. And what the bank chooses to do with that now becomes a core question. Before that $9,000, and we can see this here, the $9,000, it was actually used to give out a $90,000 loan. Now, how was the monopoly bank able to make such a large leap of faith? Well, it knew that it didn't have $90,000 necessarily all in cash on hand, but that because most money gets traded through banks and because all money would inevitably come back to it, as long as it had 10% of whatever loan went out, it would be safe in order to make that kind of risk. And so $9,000 was 10% of 90. It decided to give quite a large loan all at once. A multi-bank must be more careful. Okay? And the reason why the situation is not the same is as follows. Because the loan money may end up being used to pay a person who is a client at a different bank, the original bank, in this particular model, Bank A, cannot safely loan out more than it has on excess reserves. It does, however, have at least the ability to give that excess reserve, which in this case is $9,000 out. And so in our model, it will do that. And that will end up meaning that $9,000 will be given away. In this case, we're going to say to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown gets a loan. He takes his $9,000 and he decides to do with it what he will. The end result is that if you look at Bank A, once Mr. Brown has been given his loan, the $9,000 cash comes out of the bank. Whatever deposit he would have had is also removed, and you're left over with the following: $1,000 of cash held onto from the 10,000 deposit and a $9,000 asset in terms of a loan. Okay, and in fact, that $9,000 loan represents new money because it's a new claim beyond the initial $10,000 that was put in at the beginning. So now we have $19,000 worth of money in our economy from an initial $10,000. We've created new funds. Now, are we only going to create $9,000? Well, Bank A in this single deposit will only do that. But that won't be the end of the money creation pattern, because what's going to happen is that the person who got the loan, in this case, Mr. Brown, he's going to use that loan. And he's going to use his money to give it to Miss Green. Assuming that Miss Green is a client at Bank B, she's now going to do the same thing that the initial depositor at Bank A had done. She's going to take her money, put it into Bank B, and Bank B is now going to have $9,000 cash, which will go into their particular accounts. Just like Bank A, Bank B is going to keep 10% of that $9,000 as a required cash fund. So $900 will now be isolated and kept as a hard security against any potential withdrawals. But now there will be $8,100 left over as excess reserves. And again, they have the ability to do something with that fund. And in fact, they will. They'll give a loan to Mr. Teal. And so at the end of the day, Bank B has now created $8,100 of new money because they took the $9,000, held 900 of it that went nowhere, but gave a new loan out to a new customer for the sum of $8,100. And you can see that here. You have $9,000 that still is claimed by Mr. Brown, but $8,100 going out to Mr. Teal as a result of the transaction. What's Mr. Teal going to do with his money? Well, you can probably guess a similar sort of thing. He may bank at Bank C, so he may actually give his money to a new bank. Bank C is going to now take that money, and assuming it actually comes through Miss Navy, so Mr. Teal may pay a loan to Miss Navy, who banks at Bank C. The process is going to continue. She takes the money that was paid to her from the loan, she puts it into her account. Bank C will hold on to 10% in terms of 810. The remaining funds, the 7290, can essentially be given out as yet another loan. And so again, Bank C, from their initial $8,100 deposit, will actually create a new sum of money of 7290 because the loan is new money that hadn't been there before. If you look at the first three banks together, they'd created $24,390. So in three banks, three different deposits have created the ability to give out $24,390 that hadn't been there before. There likely would be a Bank D, a Bank E, a Bank F, and so on and so forth. And each time a new loan goes out, while there be slightly lesser funds, there would be more money put into the system and more money ultimately created through new bank loans. We're not going to do it. But if you were to continue this process until essentially there was no more money left to be put into a bank, you'd actually discover that just like the Monopoly Bank, you would end up with $90,000 in new money. Okay, and essentially that plus the initial $10,000, which is still there at the original bank, would represent the new amounts of money within your economy. And so you'd have $100,000 now in your economy and $90,000 new created from the initial $10,000 deposit. Though the multi-banking system is more complicated than the Monopoly Bank example, so long as the reserve ratio is the same for both of the two scenarios, the end result is always going to be the same in the end. And you can see here, if you want to show your final ledgers, at least for the first three banks, you can see what they would look like there. And you're going to have to do a little bit of that for your homework tonight. Now, as a general rule, the amount of money generated by a single cash deposit can be determined by a formula below. Okay, in fact, when we're looking at money creation, we don't always use accounting ledgers to figure things out. We actually have equations that can simplify at a quick glance how much money can be created in different models or different systems based on the reserve ratios and what money is going into the particular, I guess, model. The equation we have is that the change in deposits, the amount of money created in the system, will always be equal to 1 over the reserve ratio, and that would be written as a decimal. So in this case, it would be 0.1 because 10% is a decimal is decimal 1. So 1 over that amount, which we call the multiplier, times the original deposit. Okay, and for a deposit of $10,000 cash like we saw, then that would work out as follows. It would create $100,000 addition of new money into the system because 1 over 0.1, which would be 1 over 10% or 0.1 times 10,000 is essentially $100,000. Okay, and that would mean there's $100,000 based on an initial deposit of $10,000 that would end up in the system. Now, is it all new money? Not quite. The original $10,000 is actually money that was already there. And so if you want the amount of new money in your economy, then you actually have to subtract the initial deposit from that particular value. Okay, and in fact, the amount of new money is 90,000 because the $10,000 that was cash simply changed form. The $100,000 includes 90,000 in new loans, which is new money, and that original 10,000, which is just a new banking deposit. Note that the higher the reserve ratio, the less money is created, and vice versa. And as you might guess, if you wanted to have an economy that created more money, then you can reduce the burden on the banks. The lower the required reserve, the more the multiplier effect, and the more that will be created. Whereas similarly, if you wanted more conservative banks, well, you could tell them to hold on to more in reserve, but that would quickly reduce the amount of money being created because you'd have a much more strict sort of reserve ratio and a much lower multiplier number. You're going to be practicing this work a little bit over the next couple of days, and we'll talk about a little bit tomorrow in your live lesson, and then you'll have a day or two to do some practice. You should be able to, for a test, or at least for this particular series of lessons, for the activity you'll be getting for next week, do the following. First of all, you should be able to show how new money is created using balance sheets for both a monopoly bank and a series of 2 to 3 banks. And you also should be able to calculate the amount of new deposits or new additions to the money supply that might actually happen in any particular scenario or system using the money multiplier equation. Your homework eventually is going to be as follows. Please read pages 254 to 261 in your textbook, and then once you've done that, do question 5 on page 261, which by the way has a few parts, and it will show how a multi-banking system works, so you'll have to do those ledgers, and then questions 1 to 3 on page 260 are simple applications of the multiplier equation. Okay, good luck.